If you build a taxable brokerage account the way most people build a retirement account, sooner or later the taxes will teach you a lesson, and usually it is not a cheap lesson. That is the first thing I want to tell you. A taxable brokerage account is not a Roth IRA with fewer rules. It is not a 401k with more freedom. It is not a place where you can buy the same things, ignore the differences, and assume the outcome will be close enough. A taxable brokerage account is a place where the invisible details matter. The taxes matter, the yield matters, the kind of dividend matters, the way distributions are treated matters, the type of ETF matters, the timing matters, and if you do not understand that, you can think you are investing intelligently while the account quietly bleeds in places you never bothered to inspect. That is why I think a taxable brokerage account is one of the most misunderstood financial tools most ordinary investors ever use. They love the freedom. They love that they can access the money whenever they want. They love that there is no age wall standing in front of it, the way there is with some retirement accounts. That part is true. The taxable brokerage account is flexible, it is liquid, it is useful, but freedom without understanding is expensive, and taxes are very good at charging people for not understanding the instrument they are holding. The source document you gave me is strongest when it refuses to let the taxable account sound simple. It says clearly that the big difference between retirement accounts and a taxable brokerage is in the name itself. Taxes, it explains, that gains are taxable when realized, dividends create taxable events, even if reinvested, and certain high-yield products that look attractive can be structurally inefficient in taxable accounts. It then builds a 5-part ETF framework around tax efficiency, core compounding, diversification, growth, and optional higher-risk satellite exposure. Fay Felicite Fay Turn 30 File 0 Fay, that is the real value in the source, not the professor voice, not the credentials, not the coaching pitch. The real value is that it understands the taxable brokerage is not just another bucket. It is a bucket with friction. And the point of intelligent portfolio design is not merely to chase return. It is to respect friction. A lot of people never learn that. They think investing is only about what goes up the most. They ask for the hottest ETF. They ask for the biggest yield. They ask what crushed it in the last year. They ask what looks exciting. They almost never begin where adults should begin. What am I allowed to keep after the structure of the account does its work? That is the question I trust. Because return before friction is fantasy. Return after friction is reality. And in a taxable brokerage account, friction is always standing in the room. The first mistake many people make is that they are too impressed by cash flow. They see a 10% yield and their eyes light up. They see monthly distributions and feel rich. They see a product spitting out income and assume income itself must mean it belongs in the taxable account. Not all cash flow is equal, not all dividends are equal, and not all yield is your friend. The source makes this exact point with JEPQ and similar covered call style products. It explains that while the stated yield can look tremendous, a large portion of that distribution is often taxed as ordinary income rather than as qualified dividends, making it generally inefficient for a taxable brokerage, especially for higher earners. That is an extremely important warning because many people see yield first and tax character last. Fay Felicite Fay Turn 30 File 0 Fay, that is backwards. Adults do not only ask how much cash something throws off, they ask what kind of cash it is, because if the account is taxable, the government cares very much what kind of cash it is. A qualified dividend is one thing. An ordinary dividend is something else, and if you do not understand the difference, you can build a portfolio that feels satisfying every month while quietly creating a much uglier tax story every year. This is one of those places where ordinary investors get hurt precisely because the product is doing what they wanted, emotionally. It is paying them. That is the trap. The thing that comforts them psychologically may be harming them structurally. I have seen that many times in money, the product that feels most pleasant is often not the product most suited to the job. And in a taxable brokerage, job description matters. The account is not there to flatter your feelings about yield. It is there to build long-term after. Tax wealth in a flexible bucket, that is a different assignment, which is why I think the first serious rule of a taxable brokerage account is simple. Do not put something in there just because it pays you. Put it there only if the tax structure, total return profile, and role in the portfolio actually make sense. That is why the source begins with what it calls the value or dividend sleeve, but insists that the dividend needs to be a qualified one. It specifically highlights funds like SHGVIM and VTV as more thoughtful options for taxable investors because they pair broader quality and value exposure with tax characteristics that are more reasonable than the high-yield traps. Many people are first drawn to. It also distinguishes between wanting more current cash flow, which might tilt you toward SHIGI, and wanting lower yield with more emphasis on value appreciation and potentially less dividend drag, which might tilt you toward VTV, Fay File Site, Fay Turn 30 File 0 Fay. That is the sort of distinction I respect. Not best fund in the abstract, best fit for the specific friction. That is a more adult way to think. A taxable brokerage account should make you more nuanced, not less. The next mistake people make is confusing safety with laziness. They say, well, I'll just hold cash, or they park a large amount in whatever the default settlement fund is and never think harder than that. Now, I am not against holding cash when cash has a clear job. If the cash is near term spending money, fine. If it is reserve money, fine. If it is waiting for deployment with discipline, fine. But do not let unexamined cash become another form of drift. The source talks about this in a useful way too. It points out that money market funds may be fine places to hold cash, but that yields are tied to the rate environment and can decline as the Fed cuts rates. It also mentions SCUV as a treasury bill-oriented ETF that may be attractive for some investors, especially in high-tax states because of the federal structure and the absence of state tax on that income. Fay File Site Fay Turn 30 File 0 Fay that is useful because it reminds people that even cash management inside a taxable account has tax consequences and environment dependence. Nothing is quite neutral. That is another lesson of the taxable account. Everything has character. Even your safe sleeve has character. Even your waiting room has character. Even your dry powder has character. Now, let me say something else the source gets exactly right. Traditional bond ETFs are often poor taxable brokerage citizens, not because bonds are evil, because the interest income is usually taxed as ordinary income. And ordinary income is a rough costume for yield to wear in a taxable account. If you have other better places to hold such assets, the source says this directly and clearly. It advises against holding traditional bond funds in taxable brokerages because the interest distributions are primarily taxed as ordinary income. That makes them far more attractive in tax-advantaged accounts than in a taxable bucket. Fay File Site Fay Turn 30 File 0 Fay. This is one of the biggest differences between people who merely invest and people who actually allocate. The amateur says, I need bonds somewhere. The allocator says, where should bonds live so that the entire household balance sheet works better after tax? That is a completely different level of thinking, and that is the level the taxable account forces you toward if you are paying attention. Now we reach the center of the portfolio, and this is where the source becomes very strong, the foundational sleeve. I like that phrase because too many people approach a taxable brokerage account as though it is a place for experimentation, a place for hot themes, a place for things they would not trust in their retirement accounts. That is foolish. Your taxable brokerage may be one of the most important long-term wealth building tools you have. It deserves foundations. The source is right to emphasize either the S&P 500 or the total U.S. stock market as the core foundational choice, using broad, low-cost ETFs like VU or VTI. It also does a useful job explaining that when two funds track essentially the same index, fee differences and tracking fidelity matter more than superficial things like share price. That is basic. But many investors still do not understand it. Fay File Site Fay Turn 30 File 0 Fay I have always distrusted investors who are bored by the foundation. Boredom is expensive in portfolio construction. People want spice because they confuse excitement with intelligence, but the foundation is where most of the compounding comes from. The foundation is where your life gets carried. The foundation is what survives your moods. The foundation is what does not need you to be brilliant. The source makes this point by reminding people that broad-us equity exposure survived the Great Depression, the dot-com collapse, the financial crisis, and the pandemic crash, with long-term reinvested outcomes that eventually overwhelmed even those terrifying drawdowns. That is not a promise that future returns will mirror the past in neat fashion. It is a much more important lesson. The broad productive engine matters more than most people's cleverness. Fay File Site Fay Turn 30 File 0 Fay. That is exactly right. I would rather own productive America broadly than spend my life pretending I am smarter than it. That is why low-cost foundational exposure belongs in a taxable brokerage account. Not because it is thrilling, because it works. And because the account's flexibility means it may fund goals before retirement, supplement retirement, or simply build parallel wealth outside of retirement. Account restrictions. That kind of bucket deserves seriousness. The source also spends time distinguishing VTI from VOO, and I think its treatment is appropriately sober. They are close, very close. One gives you the biggest 500 names, the other gives you the total U.S. market. Over long periods, the difference is often small enough that the bigger issue is not which one is perfect, but whether you actually keep buying, keep holding, and keep letting compounding operate. Fay Fallacyte Fay Turn 30 File 0 Fay. That is another lesson most people need. Do not let small differences in a good decision keep you from making the good decision. That habit ruins more wealth than bad fund selection. Indecision disguised as optimization is very expensive. Now, after the foundation comes diversification, real diversification, not performance, chasing dressed as diversification. The source is sensible here too. It suggests an international ETF such as VEX's, but with controlled enthusiasm. It openly says that international stocks have often underperformed U.S. stocks over long stretches, even though there are periods when they do very well, and that the role here is diversification more than expected domination. That is a thoughtful way to frame it. Fay Fallacyte Fay Turn 30 File 0 Fay. This is exactly how adults should think about international exposure, not as a hero sleeve, as a diversification sleeve. And diversification is often misunderstood because people think its job is to win. Its job is not to win every year. Its job is to keep your portfolio from making one giant concentrated bet on a single geography, system, or regime. That is worth something. Not because international exposure is guaranteed to lead, because humility is a form of risk management. And a taxable brokerage account that may exist for decades should have at least some respect for humility. Then we get to growth, and this is where people start becoming dangerous, because growth is exciting. Growth gives stories, growth gives charts, growth gives bragging rights, growth gives people a chance to feel smarter than the average investor. That is why it needs discipline. The source does a good job distinguishing between broad growth and aggressive growth. In its broad growth sleeve, it points to funds like QQQM, South Carolina, HG, and VUG, arguing that they offer stronger growth potential without being pure single-theme speculation. This is a useful distinction because it keeps the portfolio connected to strong growth companies while still maintaining some breadth and institutional seriousness. Fay Fallacyte Fay Turn 30 File 0 Fay. That is sensible, because growth can be part of the core, speculation should not be. And I think that distinction is one of the most useful ones in the entire source. Too many people walk straight from broad market to whatever is hottest. They skip the middle category entirely. But the middle matters. Broad growth gives you more firepower without forcing you into one narrow tunnel. It lets you lean into innovation without making innovation your religion. That is the right tone for a taxable brokerage. You want enough growth to matter. Not so much concentration that one technological disappointment turns your wealth bucket into an emotional event. Now let us talk about the optional sleeve. The aggressive growth sleeve. This is where the source is at its most tempting and its most dangerous. It talks about semiconductor funds, metals and mining funds, Bitcoin funds, and technology-specific funds. It correctly admits these are volatile, more sector-specific, and should be smaller slices of the portfolio because they can produce huge upside, but can also fall hard and fast. That framing is important because people remember the upside much better than the fragility. Fay Fallacyte Fay Turn 30 File 0 Fay. I am glad the source labels this sleeve optional, because optional is the correct word. Not essential, not core optional. That single word may save people a lot of pain. A lot of investors do not lose because they lacked a growth sleeve. They lose because they turned an optional sleeve into a personality. That is what I distrust. I do not distrust semiconductors. I distrust worship. I do not distrust technology funds. I distrust over-concentration adopted in a state of euphoria. I do not distrust Bitcoin exposure for someone who truly understands what it is and sizes it correctly. I distrust people using it as a personality replacement for patience. That is the real danger in this category. Not the product alone, the investor's emotional posture toward the product. A taxable brokerage account is especially vulnerable to this because it feels accessible, flexible, and available for experimentation. The money is not locked behind retirement, account rules. That freedom can be constructive. It can also turn the account into a laboratory for impulses. The source does not say that directly, but it is implied everywhere in its portfolio. Construction logic. The account needs architecture precisely because its accessibility invites misuse. Fay file a site Fay turn 30 file 0 Fay. That is why I think the taxable account should be treated with a strange combination of seriousness and patience. Seriousness because taxes punish carelessness. Patience because the portfolio only makes sense if you actually let it be a portfolio rather than a collection of temporary fascinations. Now, the source does one more thing that I respect. It builds example portfolios by life stage and risk tolerance, rather than pretending there is one eternal answer. That is a mark of seriousness. A 30-year-old with high risk tolerance and a long runway may reasonably hold a much stronger growth mix than someone near retirement who mainly wants a safer supplemental bucket. A mid-career earner in prime tax years may reasonably prefer lower yield value exposure in taxable accounts to reduce ongoing tax drag while still pursuing growth elsewhere. Those are adult trade-offs, not slogans. Trade-offs, that is the only way real portfolio construction works. Through trade-offs, the Source S examples reflect that. It gives a younger investor a more growth. Heavy allocation with some aggressive growth. It shifts the middle-aged investor toward value with lower dividend drag and tax awareness. It gives the near retiree more weight in dividend and value exposure with less emphasis on the riskiest sleeve, whether or not you would use the exact same percentages. The logic is mature. Fay file a site Fay turn 30 file 0 Fay. That is how I would tell people to think too. Do not ask what are the 5 best ETFs as though they float in space independent of the investor. Ask which 5 roles actually deserve to exist in my taxable brokerage, and then which ETFs fill those roles in a tax. Our way, that is a much better question, because a taxable brokerage account is not merely a shelf of good ideas. It is a machine. And every machine has parts with jobs. One sleeve stabilizes and produces qualified dividend cash flow. One sleeve gives you the broad productive foundation. One sleeve diversifies beyond the United States. One sleeve leans into growth. One sleeve, if you truly want it, expresses a smaller high conviction or higher volatility view. That is a real architecture. Architecture is stronger than enthusiasm. Now I want to return to something that lies underneath all of this. The psychological mistake people make in taxable brokerage accounts. They think because the money is more accessible, it should be treated more casually. That is backwards. Because accessibility should not reduce discipline, it should increase intentionality. If you can access the money whenever you want, then the portfolio needs even more clarity around purpose. What does this account for? Early retirement support, bridge money optionality, wealth outside retirement rules, legacy, major future spending that is still far enough away to justify equity risk. Whatever the answer is, it has to be named, because unnamed money gets used badly. This is one of the hidden strengths of the Source too, even though it is ETF centered. It keeps quietly implying that allocation must match purpose, age, taxes, and goals. That matters because a taxable brokerage is too flexible to be run on generic enthusiasm. Purpose must lead. Faithful site, Fay turn 30 file, 0 Fay purpose also protects you from one of the oldest mistakes in investing. Confusing taxable freedom with trading freedom. A taxable account is not an invitation to become active. It is not an invitation to harvest your patience into taxable events every time your mood changes. And this is where I think the buy and hold phrase in the original title is more important than many viewers will realize. Buy and hold forever is not really about forever. It is about posture. It is about refusing to turn a tax-sensitive long-term vehicle into a machine for emotional reactions. It is about understanding that every unnecessary move may create consequences beyond what the chart alone suggests. That is why I think the best taxable brokerage portfolios feel slightly boring after you build them, not because they are weak, because they are doing their job. A proper taxable brokerage should not need to entertain you. It should need to compound for you. Those are different assignments, and entertainment is usually much more expensive. So if I had to reduce this entire source down to one Buffett-style principle, it would be this. A taxable brokerage account does not reward the investor who chases the loudest yield or the hottest theme. It rewards the investor who understands tax friction, respects simplicity, gives every sleeve a job, and lets good assets sit still long enough to become great after tax wealth. That is the lesson. Respect the taxes, respect the roles, respect the core, treat yield with suspicion until you understand its character. Treat broad market exposure with more gratitude than boredom. Treat diversification as humility, not as a popularity contest. Treat aggressive sleeves as optional, not as identity. And above all, Treat the taxable brokerage account like a serious machine, because if you do, it can become one of the most powerful wealth building tools in your entire life. If you do not, it will still teach you. It will just teach you by invoice. And those lessons are usually more expensive.